So now it starts and we can start. So Jenny, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi everyone. Very warm welcome to our Fine Art Lecture Series. And today we have Loraine Leeson with us. And yeah, as Kara mentioned, please note that we are recording this lecture and it's going to be made available on the website of the Fine Art Network. And my name is Jenny, and I'm one of the 11 early stage researchers in this network. FEINART, which is an acronym for the Future of European Independent Art Spaces in a Time of Socially Engaged Art. And as you already heard, the network encompasses 4 universities: the University of Wolverhampton, Zeppelin University, University of Edinburgh, and the University of Iceland, as well as 7 partner organizations from the art field. And yeah, if you're interested to find out more, you can visit our website, feinart.org, and you'll also find all the previous recordings, or the recordings of the previous lectures. You'll find them there as well. So let me briefly introduce Loraine Leeson. She's a visual artist whose practice and research focus on the role of art in social and environmental change. She's particularly known for her work with East London communities, from the Docklands community poster project of the 1980s to the more recent project Active Energy with older people, which has received several awards, including the 2022 Times Higher Education Award for Knowledge Exchange. And her monograph, Art Process Change, published in 2018, draws on 40 years of her work to identify methodologies for creative approaches to social transformation. And she currently teaches and conducts research at Middlesex University in London. So Loraine will talk about some of the lessons learned through the span of her art practice that encompasses activist work from the 70s and 80s, projects with communities and young people in the 1990s, experiments with new technology and collectivity in the new millennium, and more recent engagement with older people and environmental issues. So very warm welcome to you, Loraine. We're looking forward to your lecture, which will last up to 45-50 minutes. And we will have a discussion after, and everyone's very welcome to contribute with questions and comments. And you can join the discussion directly by unmuting yourself, and but you can also send your questions in the chat, and I will read them for you. All right, so I hand over to you, Loraine. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of this project, which I've been finding out more about, and it is such an important project. So it's really good to be here, and I really look forward to the discussion we might have following this presentation. I mean, what I'm doing here, I'm going to address some of those questions that often come up about social practice, but I'm going to do it through working through the work and the projects that I've been involved in. So I'm going to do a very quick run through quite a lot of decades, but I think it's because a lot of the learning particularly came at the beginning, so I don't want to miss that out. And what I'm interested in doing is passing on those lessons, because it's only through practice that we learn these things. So I'm going to start. I've called the talk the same title as my book, because in a way that's what I've done in the book, is that I've taken my practice and reflected on it to draw out what I think is the learning that I had, because this is all part of a way really of me passing on and creating a legacy for the sort of work that I've been involved in. One question I'm often asked is how projects start, and I'm going to show you a lot of different ways that projects start. But one thing that's very important, a good friend and colleague of mine, Alva Murphy, who I believe did one of your earlier presentations, she said, and I always remember this, it's the quality of the invitation, whether that's community to artists, artists to community, curator to artists and or community, that has a huge bearing on the integrity of the work and on the experience that follows. So what I read from that is that the work has to be based on need. So it doesn't really matter how that need is expressed, but it is a different situation to one I sometimes encounter when I meet students who say, I have a fantastic project and I'm looking for a community to do it with. And I have to say, I'm really sorry, but that's the wrong way round. You need to start again the other way round. You need to listen and you need to ask. You need to observe and you need to respond. So I've been looking for ways that art, I think since I graduated as in the 70s, I've been looking for ways to use art to make a difference. I wasn't interested at the time in speaking to the gallery going public. I was looking for ways that I could use art that I knew to be so powerful in the service of ideas and change that I felt was important. And so I'm going to start very early, right at the beginning. And well, not quite at the beginning. What I would say is that when I first left university, I was working with my partner at the time, Peter Dunn, and we were looking for ways that we could do this to make a difference through the work. We tried to do some work in libraries, and it was image and text, and nobody really read the text, and we kept making it bigger and no one read it, and we realized we weren't really doing it as part of something. And so we were looking for opportunities to work in a different way. And the next opportunity that came up was although I studied fine art, I specialized in photography, film and video, and Peter and I were sharing a residency in East London to run film and video workshops, and the local hospital was going into occupation, and they asked us if we would make a video for them, a campaign video. That was lesson number one. We tried to make a campaign video through participatory workshops and realized that it was like very contradictory, because people have to fail when they have to experiment, they have to fail, they don't know how to use the equipment, but a campaign video has to be produced very quickly and it has to be good. And so we quickly learned that we managed to produce some sort of video and do a lot of editing out of camera shake and all the rest. But we realized that we will be more effective if we work collaboratively rather than in a participatory way at that time. Now, I'm going to come back to participation later, but what we thought about at the time was actually working with the campaign committee might be more effective. So we were around documenting the campaign and taking photos, and then they asked us if we'd do some posters. So we produced some posters and the campaign put them up. And then we realized that people didn't necessarily know. So the posters, I don't know if you can see my cursor, there's a couple here, the health cuts can kill, and somebody's holding one in that bottom right hand corner. The rest of these images are from an exhibition that we then created for the hospital foyer, because a lot of people didn't understand what it meant for a hospital to be in occupation. So it was a series of photo montage, physical photo montage panels, which we laminated as you did at the time, and we put them in the foyer, and they took you through from the crisis in capitalism all the way through to the situation in East London and the situation for that hospital. But that began to be something that was then meaningful for that campaign. So it felt like, as I said, we knew the power of art, but we wanted to apply that power to people who we felt needed to be recognised for what they were doing and to support the issues that they were so well versed in organising. So we weren't trying to run a campaign, but we became the artist. We created artist input for it, which then takes me on to the next. So the next thing that happened was that the campaign came to an end. There was some funding left over, and rather than put it into leaflets, as would normally have been the case, they recognised that the imagery was far more powerful. So they set up a steering group, as people who are well versed in organising do, So we had members of the NALGO and UP health workers unions, and we had somebody from the trades councils, and we had somebody from local health campaign, and they talked to us about what the posters needed to be about, who were they for. In fact, it wasn't even posters to begin with. They didn't know it. We needed to get the information out, so we just talked about whether it should be film or video. That suggested having an audience, and where would they be. For younger people, there was no computers then, there was no phones, smartphones then, so film and video meant that people had to sit down and watch. No, we talked about all the different media, and then we decided we'd produce something that wasn't for fly posting, but that would go up in doctors' surgeries and waiting rooms, etc. So we had this steering group, and it was a very exciting way to work. Other artists would say to us, isn't it designed by committee? Isn't it the lowest common denominator? You know, that, but actually it wasn't that at all, because everyone was putting in their expertise. So we didn't know what the issues were. They weren't trying to tell us how to make imagery. They would talk to us about what the issues were, and we would create imagery. Then we'd talk about what it meant and what they read from it, and then we could change it if it didn't mean the right things. So we produced, these are just four, but we produced a whole series of posters for the East London Health Project. So, you know, at the time, I think we weren't even paid for this, but they paid for all the printing. I think I was signing on, as you could do in those days. And then I did a bit of part-time teaching after that. So that's how I was surviving. And in short life housing, I'm saying all this because the times have changed. And it was, in some ways, we weren't exactly well off, but we were surviving and able to do this work and find the means to do it. While we were doing this, at the end of the 70s, at the end of 1979, the Thatcher government, the conservative, most right-wing conservative government the UK has ever had, came into power. And one of the things they wanted to do is it was the area around the docks in London. It wasn't called the Docklands at that point. But there were less ships coming upriver because because of containerization, they were docking further down the river, which could manage bigger ships. There was still some shipping, and there were a lot of warehouses and small industry, a lot of people living there, but they just saw it as the biggest bit of real estate in Europe. And they put in plans and even changed the law to allow themselves to put in a London Docklands Development Corporation that would take all the power away from local authorities in the area and be only answerable to central government. So this is a large area. It's 11 miles east of Tower Bridge, if any of you know that part of London, and for quite a few miles north and south of it. So because of the work we'd done before, this was the invitation again, we were asked if we'd do a poster about it. Well, this area of London is where people have settled over the years, who've come in through the docks, through the port. It's the industrial area of London, it's the working class area. People have struggled to survive. And so they're very organised. And so when these proposals came about, and they realised that all the local plans that were going to be improving the area, it had been all Labour councils, local councils in the area, all those plans were being thrown out, and it was being put in the hands of a right-wing government. They just got together, and so each area, again, it wasn't a united area, federated all their tenants and action groups, and they created small action groups in each area to represent the needs of people there. So they created a democratic structure. That meant it was possible for us to then go to those people and say, well, we've been asked to make a poster, what do you want? And what people said to us, well, we want posters, but we want big posters. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. We want big posters. We want graphics to help with our campaigns. We need people to know the information in more depth, and we need documentation that isn't just by the media. So there was no money, but what we did is we took the model that we had learned through the East London Health Project, and we set up a steering group of people from all those areas. And then we sat down together and worked out how we would do these things. So how would we do big posters? We had no idea. Billboards at the time, you could sometimes get a commercial company to loan you use of one of their billboards, but they were cited for passing cars to get a brand name across. And people said, we need these in the central in our communities. So we came up with a method of doing this, and we applied to the one local authority, which had a very radical arts committee, for some money. They gave us some materials money. We applied to, again, this is some.
You're muted all of a sudden, yeah.
Yeah. And we went to the Regional Arts Association and put our proposal to them, and they gave us a half-time residency between the two of us for 6 months. Well, that's amazing. You couldn't go and ask for something now. You'd be told what you could have, and you'd have to apply for it with a lot of competition. So we had a little bit of a start, and then an extraordinary thing happened politically in London. Is that in the midst of the most right-wing government, the government for London went Labour, and then it went left Labour. And so it was headed, if anyone has heard of Ken Livingstone, headed up this Greater London Council, and they began to change the amazing policies that changed London for a number of years. And we went to the chair of the Arts and Recreation Committee and said, we want to build a large poster site, and would you fund us? And he said, why do you only want one? Again, that wouldn't happen again. So that wouldn't happen now. So the GLC, Greater London Council, they didn't have planning authority in the area, but their strategy was, their political strategy, much like Jeremy Corbyn's more recently, was to support those groups who were working in the area. So not to do politics, not top down, but to support and allow communities and others to develop and make things happen in their area. They'd already funded the Joint Docklands Action Group, which brought together all those different communities who had got their small groups together, and they coordinated the campaigning over a number of years in Docklands, and eventually they funded us, and we were able to, for 5 years, and then with some follow-on funding that we managed to pick up from the Regional Arts Association, we carried on for 10 years working as what became, I would say, the cultural arm of this campaigning community. So we did what we called photo murals. I think the term got invented through this. And then we also, to do the photo murals, we had no idea how to do it, and you couldn't just print it because billboards then were printed en masse, and you couldn't do a one-off. So we did it photographically. So we already did Montage, so we created Montage artwork about A1, and we'd send this to a lab to be rephotographed with a large format camera in 18 sections. Each section was blown up and then pasted onto plywood, marine ply we discovered, so it wouldn't buckle, and then hand coloured, because you couldn't do colour printing then of that sort. We'd hand coloured, and then we'd varnish it with yacht varnish, and then each panel would be carried up ladders and screwed into the backing board. So there were 18 panels. And so this was the first image. So our steering group basically wanted to start with what the question was on everyone's lips. What's going on? There was corrugated iron around a lot of empty land, and nobody knew what was going on. They knew all the local plans had been thrown out. They knew that some people had tried campaigning. So that was how we started. And then what we realized, of course, was that when we took down these panels, we could actually use them as a means of changing the image more gradually. And so, oh, I'm just trying to work out how to, oh yeah. So that's what we did with the first few panels. They gradually came down, and you see the edges of the panels, and then it went into the next image. The imagery was also created through us going to every meeting of every organisation. The Joint Docklands Action Group coordinated all these meetings around Docklands, and somebody said at a meeting, well, what's happening is big money's moving in and pushing out local people. So that was the next image. And they were saying how community was being thrown on the scrap heap. And what we did here is we left the top line of panels there, and we just changed the bottom 2 lines of panels, so you could see you were tracking down the abyss to where people were being thrown on the scrap heap. But then what people said is, but actually we're not on the scrap heap. We don't want to represent ourselves like that. It's the developer's design for Docklands that is putting us on the scrap heap. So then we, as you can see, we've moved up 2 layers of panels and put on another one along the bottom here. And then we've moved from photography into drawing to show that this was a design for Docklands. It wasn't how people actually were. And then to reinforce that, and also to reflect what was going on, I have to say it took several months for these to change. We hadn't done a whole set of panels to begin with, a full set of designs. We were keeping up with it. You know, we did one, and then we did another, and then we started working on the next one. But that meant also that we could be responsive. And so the campaigning changed, and from being oppositional, people began to realise that it was much more effective to use their strength and to work on alternatives. So our next image reflected the fact that the community were just going to break through this way of thinking. Literally, this is a montage. That's the same image that was up before, except the 4 middle panels removed. And that imagery, I had pasted onto broken glass, rephotographed it, had that blown up, had it sandwiched between perspex, and then that was literally screwed onto the hoarding. So you can see in that inset that the way the panels were on, and then the caption at the bottom is literally a board that is screwed over the other caption. So this is a montage on the board, on the hoarding. And then it went into the final image, which was, you know, like using the convention of a history painting and putting the people in the front who are important, and then documenting everyone else who had a role in everything in the background of the Docklands. And it documented a lot of these people from the People's Plan Centre sweeping the shards of broken glass off the picture. So this was, and this caption was from what somebody had said about the birthright of the people, the chair of the Association of Whoopee organisations. So that was our first sequence. Then we did other sequences. They wanted to do something on housing, but felt in order to understand how housing is now, people had to understand the history of housing and where it came from. So we did a historical sequence, which was quite challenging because we had to use historical material that necessarily showed people as victims, and we wanted to offset that. So we offset it using this caption that the people of Docklands have always had to fight to make the best of appalling conditions and to change them. So to celebrate the fact that the people who are there now are the survivors, not victims of the situation. It went a bit further than this. It went through to post-war, and we were working on the 70s version, which was because this one was Homes for Heroes post-war. Then we were working on No More Heroes for the 70s. We had to stop because other issues came up, and so at this time we had about we built 8 different photo mural sites. We had 6 in operation at any one time, so these images were moving around. But we had to then take a break to work on images such as Canary Wharf and the Royal Docks, etc. So we made a stop there. And the other work, people have said they wanted the documentation of what was going on. So we were photographing all the time. And these are now in the Museum of London Docklands, which is the only record they have from the community's point of view of the campaigning. It wasn't ever meant as that sort of legacy, but actually it is interestingly, it is the cultural products that end up, the shards of the pots that tell you about the life of the time. And so it is the remnants, the cultural remnants that stand now as the archive of what happened there. We created a whole load of travelling exhibitions. As you can see, we've got a few here, one on housing, another one on the history of the docks, another one here on the People's Armada, and then a whole range of them. These were all laminated panels on lightweight boards that we could put up at a moment's notice in a marquee or in a meeting, whatever. So they were all designed to fit in the back of our estate car. We could fit in all the panels and the boards and put them up in about half an hour. And then there were other initiatives to respond to, such as the People's Plan for the Royal Docks that was an alternative. I was talking about alternative plans. This was an alternative to London City Airport, which wasn't going to offer hardly any jobs or houses or the amenities that people needed. Interestingly, although it wasn't successful, it forced the proposal to public inquiry, and they threw out the People's Plan because they said it wasn't democratic, and they kept the LDDC plan that, of course, wasn't at all democratic because they were only answerable to central government. But nevertheless, the plan was such an innovative thing that it has continued to be researched, and I will show you several towards the end that we had an event only this weekend of a walk around and people discussing the People's Plan because of the lessons that are being learned from it. Another series of events were the People's Armadas to Parliament. So in one meeting, somebody said, isn't it time we took a petition to Parliament? And somebody else said, well, we're on the river and they're on the river. Let's take it on the river. And then somebody else said, well, I'm a lighterman and I have a barge on the Thames. Would you like to use that? And then we decided to decorate it. And so the Joint Docklands Action Group coordinated all the groups in the area. We coordinated all the arts groups in the area. So we had this armada. We had over 1,000 people on the river. And that was just the first one. There were 3. And this small image, the second one down, is where there were all these songs and poetry that had been written about it. So it would go down the river with all this music blasting out. It was one of those sort of campaigns that brings tears to your eyes, and it meant that all those sorts of people who wouldn't be standing outside in the rain with a placard, but all took part in this. So it ended in a mixture between in Jubilee Gardens near opposite the House of Parliament, in a marquee that was offered by the GLC as a mixture between a community festival and a political rally, where the aim was to get the incoming, or what we considered the incoming MPs and politicians to pledge what they would do on day one of getting into power, because that was the best strategy. Sadly, there were 3 terms of Thatcherism, and they didn't get into power until most of the land had been sold off. But nevertheless, it was an event that sort of went down in history. You can see the fire barge here, who joined in. I mean, everyone joined, and it was just one of those amazing events. But you know, it was so successful, the GLC, not just in the Docklands, but it was successful in all its policies, that the government had to get rid of it. And they couldn't find a way, apart from bad press, and there was a lot of bad press about it. But in the end, they had to abolish all the metropolitan authorities in the country. That means they abolished the government for London, for Manchester, for Leeds, for Birmingham, etc., so that they could get rid of a tier of government, and therefore they could get rid of the GLC. And London was in chaos for about 10 years. We now have the Greater London Authority, but it has nothing like the powers of the GLC. So that's what happened at the end of the 80s. We carried on. The GLC was abolished in the middle of the 80s, but as I said, we carried on for a few years with a bit of funding from the Regional Arts Association. And then after that, we had to decide what to do. So we decided that we would keep the organisation. We renamed it The Art of Change, and we decided we would start working on smaller projects for which we would need to fundraise or be commissioned to do. And we would deal with some of the other issues that were coming up in the area, because this was a huge area of change. And so there was so many things that were happening that we'd been concentrating on planning issues for 10 years. So it felt quite refreshing to be able to work on other projects. And so I've just put in, we had many projects for the next 10 years. I don't know how come, but it seems to all go in 10-year cycles. We reused the billboards, and we did projects with schools. So this was the first schools project I'd ever done, but working with the pupils to represent what they felt, who they felt themselves to be. You could see throughout, we are getting less and less text. We had learned this as a lesson that people read imagery more than they read text. So the text became part of the imagery. I won't go into this. It was a really fascinating project. I felt really privileged to work with this group, and it was a huge learning curve as well, because before I'd worked with activists who knew how to brainstorm, and here I was working with a group of young people, a lot of whom who didn't speak English, who didn't discuss. Only they'd chat to each other, but they didn't discuss, and we had to communicate with each other a lot of the time through imagery. So I had to learn how you draw out ideas in a group where it's not just about brainstorming. There were many other projects. This was one with a colleague who worked in another arts organisation, Cultural Partnerships, and Karen Merkel, and she was she worked in community media, and we partnered with the group Women Against Fundamentalism to look at the issues about what was happening to women in a situation where women were being forced back into the home across a lot of different cultures. And they wanted to bridge that gap across the cultures, which were always being set against each other. And so we produced with them a tape slide, which is technology of the time, that turned into a video and exhibition that they then used in their educational work, and then they took abroad and used in conferences, etc. Other projects I won't mention. This was a commission by the Tate Gallery. This was the first time the Tate had ever commissioned anything that was community-based. And they commissioned 5 different organisations. And they didn't really know what they wanted us to do. They just said, could you work with one of your communities? So I'd already worked with this school on the Isle of Dogs, a school which had a lot of challenges and really needed the input. And I had a good relationship with the staff. So we worked with them, and the brief was to remake a work in the Tate's collection. And to cut a long story short, the young people worked through a lot of different images. They'd never been to a gallery before, so they got introduced to the Tate, and we got them to choose an image that they liked and then remake it in terms of themselves in paint to begin with. We did this because that had to fit in with the curriculum. And that was something else I learned on this project, that if you don't do something in a school that fits in with the curriculum, it's extra. And therefore you don't get all the energy and the time of the staff and the students. So it's much better to do something that fits with the curriculum. We worked through a series of processes, but eventually remade Sally Spencer's Resurrection. I realise time is pressing on, so I might click through these a bit more quickly. This was the Tate's first ever website project, and we did it with a couple of schools where the the computers didn't arrive. This was at the beginning of computerizing school, so I had to do it with a laptop in the classroom. And we got the kids to remake, the brief was to work with the Stanley Spencer exhibition at the Tate, to remake, choose one of his paintings and remake it about themselves, which is what made it interesting for them. I'd had too many experiences where I'd taken my own children into galleries and saw them getting really bored. And so by saying, choose something that you like, and choose somebody who you'd like to be like, or a place that you'd like to go, and then we got them to make the person they would like to be in relation to that. And also very early internet this. At the time, I also got them to write about themselves as the artist and all their influences, as in the catalogue, the Stanley Spencer catalogue, but also to post a question on the site that they would like somebody in the world to answer. And this was before social media. So what I did is I emailed all those questions to everyone I knew in the world, and they got these answers. So these kids who really were in a school which gave them not very many prospects, they were asking questions like, how can I study graphic design in New York? And then get an answer. How can I become a successful writer? And somebody in the States or wherever would write back to them and tell them what to do. That was the most interesting bit for me, because I was beginning to be interested in what the internet could do. And that took me into the next phase of work. So at the end of the 90s, we lost our funding, so we had sort of part funding throughout, but also Peter and I went our separate ways. We had run the organisation together. So what I did is I set up a new charity, CSpace, which I did in the University of East London, where I was a visiting research fellow. So I wasn't employed by the university, but I had a deal where I could use one of their rooms and facilities, and they would use my work for their research. So I called it CSpace because I was beginning to get interested in cyberspace. And I did a number of projects there, including, and again, there was no funding for this, so I had no income. Everything was fundraised. But I did some, I won some commissions. So this was a public artwork for Barking, which is meant to be based on their heritage and looking towards their regeneration. So I worked with a school that was on, I don't really like big bits of things on roundabouts, but I just thought I wanted to do something that wasn't too much of a lump of a thing. It represented the fishing industry that Barking used to have, but also I worked with all the children in the school, the junior school that bordered this roundabout. And I did that by involving college students and university students who mentored each other and were placed in each classroom. So I did it as part of a mentoring scheme, which involved 3 levels of education. But my interest in the internet and its creative possibilities continued, and I was really fascinated as what would happen with the collective creativity, because up to now I'd only worked with small groups. And I did one project that was like a collective story, and out of that I worked with a junior school, so 400 children on that, and they produced a story between them which you could dip into and understand. It was interactive. And out of that I thought, well, what would happen if all these children created a new world? What would it be like? But it would need to be done in a way that I didn't tell them what it was like. They absolutely had to invent it, but what I had to do was create the frameworks that would allow them to do it. Now, frameworks is a term that I've arrived at because I've learned, and I learned it actually in that West Meets East project, that first billboard project with the school, that in order to make something work where you want a lot of input, you need to create a frame. Now there, I might have created a physical frame, or I might have created areas that the children or the young people filled in information. But here, I was creating a framework that was organizational as well. So in order to create a planet, what did they have to do? Well, I had a little animation that took them through the story of the fact that the Earth was dying and people were evacuating the planet, and most people were going to Mars, but a few people have heard of another planet and another solar system where you could work together cooperatively and create a new society. And so we went down this wormhole in this animation and arrived at Planet Volco. And you never see Planet Volco and you never see a Vulcan, because this wasn't about avatars. I wasn't very keen on dealing with outward reality, because I wanted to connect people. I'd done a lot of work in conflict resolution at this point, and I was interested in how I could make connections with children, with other children who they didn't know, but actually would find what they had in common with. And so each Vulcan had to create an identity for themselves. And you'll see there's one in German there. In the end, I did this project with over 1,000 children in 4 countries. And I did it by training teachers, because by doing that, the children and the teachers were learning about using the technology, which they weren't doing very easily, at least in this country at the time. And so they invented, the children, they invented a class for themselves, a settlement, which they put on the Vulcan map. Then they invented a character, which they did by using every bit of technology they had in the school. They had to use everything in the cupboard that was never being used, the cameras, the scanners, and they had to download things from the internet, and they had to write things. But I worked with this designer who I had started working with on that previous project with the schools where the equipment hadn't arrived. And I've worked with him ever since. And he helped me create these frameworks so the children could upload all their own imagery. Because at the time, I remember watching my own children playing these computer games where they had to choose an avatar. And I thought, well, what if you don't want to be one of those? So here they could actually create their own Vulcan based on a Pokemon card, I would say, the process. So lots of sections where you can fill in information, but you don't have to fill in what you look like unless you want to describe it. And then at the end, we joined up the kids through very early video conferencing. So they met each other, having already invented their characters. And then what they did is they had to go into a discussion forum where they could come up with ideas for the planet. And once they'd discussed it, they could upload image and text. So gradually the Vulcan archives expanded. But when the kids got together online, they sort of knew each other through their Vulcan characters. And so they were very excited to meet each other. And when they saw each other, were just very excited that there were the diversity that they didn't expect. They thought all the English kids, this was a school in North Carolina the first time I did it, but then I linked up kids in lots of different places. The kids in North Carolina thought our kids would speak like, they'd all be white and speak like the Queen. And they were all delighted to find their differences and their similarities. So anyway, that was 10 years, that project. I raised all sorts of money, including regeneration money. I didn't call it art. I called it education, which was quite useful. So I managed to raise quite a bit of, about £100,000 over 10 years to do that project. So to begin with, it was quite easy to raise money. There were a lot of other projects I'm not showing you. This was another one with teenagers at the prospect of getting the 2012 Olympic Games in London that was full of a lot of hype about involving young people, but actually didn't. So I just thought I would use the opportunity to involve a lot of young people. And we made together a guide to East London. And I basically said to all sorts of different groups across schools, after school clubs, disability groups, referral units, youth offending teams, all sorts of different groups. And I just said, we're making this guide to the for young people who are going to come over for the Olympics, and they won't know where to go, and only you know where they should go in East London. So would you like to help me work out where that should be? And by the way, thousands of people will look at this, which they did. So they, in order to do that, therefore, they had to learn a bit of photography, because they had to photograph their sites, they had to write about their sites, so they had to do an awful lot of creative work, which we did very quickly over a couple of days in most situations. And then we created both an online guide and a newspaper that I managed to raise money for the young people to distribute prior to the Games. And while I was still doing CSpace, I was invited to do a residency, a very short-term residency, 6 weeks, to work with older people. And I'd not worked with older people before, but I found the prospect quite interesting. And it came at the end of a university research project that was looking at why the fact that older people were failing to inform new developments in technology, and yet they had so much life experience. So I met a particular group called, self-named, I should say, the Geezers, based at an Age UK centre in East London. And I just asked them the question, well, what technology would you like to see develop that would support yourselves or your community? I had no idea what they would say. And I thought maybe they'd come up with gadgets, and we had to do a little exhibition at the end of this, that perhaps that's what we would do. And then one of them said, whatever happened to tidal power? He said, I remember it was decades ago now, but it was in the news. It wasn't just wind and solar power. It was all tidal power, wave power, all these things were in the news. Well, I remember that as well. It turned out, of course, that the Thatcher government had stopped all the funding for that. And when Labour government had come in, they funded wind and solar. So we looked into it and we discovered that it was really sensible on a series of islands, surrounded and crisscrossed by water and tides, to have tidal power, because it's not dependent on the wind. They're constant, the tides. And as this geezer said, and we have a tidal river down the road. We have the River Thames. So why aren't we using it to power our community? At the end of that session, they all wanted to do it. And I had to say, I know absolutely nothing about tidal power, but I'll take you every step of the way that I can. So I was based at UEL at the time, and I found they had a director of sustainability. We got some information. We did some research together. We discovered that we needed a barrage, but we have the Thames Barrier that was ideal for putting turbines on, because only the central lanes were used for shipping. So our exhibition was, about why are there not tidal turbines on the Thames Barrier? The Geezers really found their voice. These were a load of working class men. They were very practically minded. They loved the idea of the design of the turbines, because not very much effort had been put in over the years to coming up with new designs. So they were really fired up by this. There was a symposium at the end. They spoke. And they really found their voice, and they were the stars of the whole thing. But they didn't want to stop there. So they were coming up with all these different designs. So I raised a bit of money. I could only find money through Comic Relief, which generally just funds. I found out they would fund older people if they for workshops. So I proposed a set of workshops run by an artist, and we and then got the guys computerized, so they had their own laptop and they had some training, and they could do their research. And then meanwhile, the gallery that had done the commission, that was Space Studios, people might know it in the UK, they saw we were going and they raised some money to do an intergenerational project. So we then did a project with a local school who wanted to work on wind power. Well, what I've discovered is when you have one of these projects and they're gaining momentum, is that somehow people and resources throw themselves on board. We didn't have anything to begin with, but then people wanted to come back and work with us. And meanwhile, I discovered a prototyping lab on the university campus, and this young man here, Toby Borland, worked with us for years. In fact, even when he stopped working at UEL, we employed him on a freelance basis. And he was a very creative, lateral thinking engineer, and really opened up his prototyping laboratory to us. And this, the person in the middle, Professor Stephen Dodds, he invented the control system for the European Space Commission. So he was quite a renowned scientist, and he wanted to join us. And so we had all this expertise, and then we had people raising money. And also, I had to be, in a way, very opportunistic. So when opportunities came my way, I then brought them to bear on it. So I had a residency in Pittsburgh, and I asked to work with a group of older people there, and I met Northside Seniors, a group of women. I introduced them to the geezers, and together they came up with their ideas for a project they wanted to do, and the exhibition was all about the geezers and Northside Seniors projects, which we showed at the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh. Meanwhile, back at home, plans for the to test a tidal turbine on the Thames were in progress, and we tested it on a barge opposite the House of Parliament. And then a bit later, I joined Middlesex University, and they had a project called Hydra Citizenship, which was looking at the relationship of people and water. And there were a lot of universities involved, about £1.5 million project. But they worked with the River Lee. Well, the River Lee is a tributary, a tidal tributary of the Thames. So we turned our attentions to that and what the needs were there. Well, this river is literally just around the corner from where the geezers meet. And it was a river that they used to fish in as boys. And the problem is that the fish were dying because the sewage would overflow in certain weather conditions. And what they were having to do was put aerators in the water to pump air into the water because it was the lack of oxygen that made the fish die. But it was very expensive to keep the aerators going. So we invented this water wheel that would rise and fall with the tide because it's a very deep tidal flow here, tidal range. And it was driven by the outflow from an old tidal mill. So when the header pool would fill up, it would empty and it would drive the water wheel, and the water wheel then would drive an aerator, and that would help pump air into the river. So that was something we worked on initially. And then we did another one for the Olympic Park. And then we did another schools project with this, so that the young people all made different sorts of turbines, which they tried out. You can see we've still got Toby working with us, and we had partnerships with various groups. We had Thames 21, and this was Canal and River Trust talked to the young people about the environmental issues of the river. And then we had an event in the Olympic Park where we invited the chief manager of from the Greater London Authority, the one that replaced the GLC. He was responsible for climate change and what the GLA were going to be doing for climate change. Well, the young people had all been very well briefed and done their research, and so they came armed with questions about what they were going to do for London. So there was a very lively debate in which the young people put their questions and proposals to this guy, and so did the geezers, who had then had many years of experience in this. And I think the aim of this, if any, was in part the conclusion of the project, but it also gave a voice to the young people. They realised that they could ask these questions, and they deserved answers, and sometimes their suggestions were better than what was being already done. So in a way, that was part of the aim of the project. But we had to draw it to a close eventually. It lasted 12 years. It was never intended to, this was a 6-week commission, but it came to a natural conclusion, partly because the geezers drove it, their interest and enthusiasm, and eventually some of them died, some of them became incapacitated, and so it didn't, and even though new geezers joined it, it didn't feel right to continue. So that was the end of Active Energy. Well, meanwhile, I continued at Middlesex, and one of my aims of working in the university was not just, or partly it was legacy. I want to pass on what I've learned, and that was the reason for writing the book. So it made it easier to get the book published. I was able to teach social practice and pass on the skills, but also I'd been raising money and was getting more and more difficult to raise money externally, particularly after the economic crisis in 2007 and 8. And so I thought, well, there's research funding, so perhaps I need to learn how to do that. So I came into the university. I then was involved in the Hydra Citizenship project, and then I discovered that it turns out that research culture has now caught up with us social practitioners at last. So now, as any of you know who work in universities, you know that the buzzwords are knowledge exchange. Well, we all do knowledge exchange, don't we? Impact. Well, all our work is to make a difference. So in fact, the work that we do as social practitioners feeds very well into research culture. And to the extent that, even though I had worked out how to frame my work to fit into research, in fact, the Active Energy project won the Knowledge Transfer Initiative of the Year from the Times Higher Education Awards last year, which was an absolute delight for the geezers. And so that was a way that, you know, it has now got integrated. But the other thing that happened is that it was now possible. One of my aims has been to bring the arts to bear on social and environmental issues, because the arts is such a powerful tool and rarely used effectively as I could see it in these ways. But since the work I'd done on Hydra Citizenship, I had then academics approached me to work on a project of all places in Rajasthan, in the Rajasthan desert, where they were having great difficulty in uncovering and reinstating the knowledge that people had lost over a generation for conserving water in one of the Earth's driest regions. And the environmental scientists there were rather stuck because they were taking all this information around to the villages and people weren't really acting on it. So they asked me to work on it as an artist. I said, well, I can't work in Rajasthan. I don't know the context there at all, but what I can do is involve local artists. So there were two amazing artists who worked with us. One, Anurupa Roy, who was a puppeteer, and puppetry is one of the traditions of Rajasthan. And she worked with the children, who then interviewed their grandmothers. It was women's work to collect and conserve water, to uncover some of those issues. And they created shadow puppet shows that went round the schools, and an exhibition that went round the schools of all the different devices that were used. And meanwhile, Nina Sabnani, who works with the traditions of storytelling, she involved local traditional mural painters to create a mural in one of the villages about the story of the water and how it used to be conserved, then what happened after that, and then it went away, and then what people have to do to bring it back. This was also created as a scroll that went round the villages. And so the storytelling tradition is that a storyteller will come at night with a lantern, and they will take the lantern across the mural or across the scroll and tell the story to the villages. So that was a way that then the arts got introduced to water conservation. The same team then went on to work with in Kashmir with children who had experienced conflict there, and we involved local art therapists and the puppeteers again. But also what was very useful is that there were some child health specialists and other public health specialists and political experts, who were then able to create a proper evaluation of how the arts had worked in this context. Because quite often in socially engaged practice, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is that it gets done, it gets documented, but it doesn't really get evaluated in terms of its efficacy. So now we actually have proof of how it works, and now we've got some follow-on funding to take that project further afield. Another project, again, I'm working as a co-investigator on these projects, which is a very nice situation for me, because in the way I'm working with other people who are not artists, and I'm bringing the arts to bear on whatever it is they're doing. This project is looking at community-led planning, which harks back to the People's Plan in the Docklands that I told you about. So they're looking at community-led planning all over the country to create an archive of lessons, again, that people can draw on for planning in the future. These images on the right are from last Sunday. So we had a walk around the Docklands. An artist had actually done a public artwork based on the People's Plan. And we had a walk, and we had an event and discussions, and a celebratory cake for its 40 years. So that is still rumbling on, which is fantastic. And then just very briefly, I suppose the last, I talked about being interested in legacy. Well, I'm also interested in teaching social practice and how best to do that, particularly in a university situation, which is often quite contradictory in lots of the ways you have to teach. So I was discussing these things with my colleague Greg Chalette, some of you may know, about how we could do this better. And we thought that we could look at how we could involve cultural institutions and also draw on the international contacts, because that's what you're doing here as well. Most of the people I know who are doing this work aren't where I am. They're not in London. They're not in my university. They are, although I'm discovering more who are in my university, which is a delight, working in other disciplines, in other creative disciplines. But a lot of the people I've known are in different countries, and we all, informally converse. And so this project was really to look at how we could, well, to answer these two questions, how we could look at collaborating with cultural institutions and how we could build on our international communications. So we did all sorts of interactions and workshops and exchanges, etc. But out of that has come, and finally, that this was mainly between US and UK and some input from Ireland, because those were my main contacts. But I knew it was happening everywhere else. And so I was lucky to be able to give a presentation at the ELIA conference, I think some of you may know, which is the organisation, the European organisation that creates networks in Europe and dialogue. And I presented the project at the biennial conference. And out of that, a lot of people were interested. And I've set up now what I'm calling a Social Art Educators Forum. So we are meeting informally once a month and having discussions between people who either teach or support social practitioners, so that we can share our knowledge, share strategies, interact with each other, come up with ideas with each other. So this is happening at on the last Friday of every month. If anyone is interested, you can see my email address down there, so you can write to me and I will add you to the list. At the moment, we have people involved from 23 different countries, which is really exciting. Not everyone comes. We have a group probably a bit the size of this one, but it means that we have all sorts of different dialogues. Different people come at different times, and it's a fantastic way to keep networking and to be sharing our knowledge with each other, much as your project is doing. I'm doing this in a very small way, but please do join. You're more than welcome. And so that's all I have to say, apart from I thought I might end on this quote by Bertolt Brecht, which is about the importance of art, not art as a research method, not an artistic approach to things, but the fact that art as a discipline that creates meaning is central to moving things forward. It's a powerful tool, and we must not lose the fact that art is itself generates knowledge, and for it not to be an add-on, and for it to be central, which is what I'm still aiming to do. So thank you very much for listening. I realise that was quite a long talk, so thank you for your patience, and I would be really interested to know if you've got any questions or ideas that have come out of this.
Thank you so much, Loraine. Yeah, so we're opening for a discussion and your questions.
Comments. Lose the presentation, then we can see each other.
Right. How can we stop sharing the screen? Karen, do you have control of that?
Oh.
Karen, you're muted, but yeah. Publish.
No. Where's the stop sharing?
Stop sharing.
Out there.
Okay, perfect.
So.
Yeah, thank you again, Loraine. And yeah, if there are any questions, comments, please feel free to enter the space and share your questions in the chat as well. That was so impressive to have you like run us through your whole trajectory so far, your whole work. Although you said there are many other projects that you didn't mention. So I maybe maybe a personal, or I would be curious to hear what has been driving you throughout these years, because it sounds like you've been invested like in this with your entire energy. So I'm like, just on a personal note, I would be curious to hear what has been driving you in this practice, and how you, and maybe is there something in your background, like also in your how you in your upbringing that brought you to this kind of practice?
I have no idea. I do know in the 70s, a lot of us felt that if we joined together enough, we could change the world. And I'm still trying to do that. And I'm trying to do it through my discipline, which is art. And I think when I learned art, I studied art, and I discovered how powerful it was, I just felt this is something that we need to do differently. I think there are ways we can do this. And I think that has driven me throughout, actually. And it is still driving me. It's still the most exciting thing I can think of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Karen.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really impressive guided tour through your work. And I have actually two very different questions. One is, you mentioned several times, you spoke of the power of art, of the immense power of art. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that, how it comes that you have this belief that art has such a power. Because sometimes I think we actually work in a kind of niche and the power is maybe sometimes overstated in the art field. So how comes that is you still believe in it? And the second question is more a technical one, because you at the beginning, when you were talking about the project in the 70s and 80s, you said that you set up steering groups. And I'm really interested how you did that and how it worked, how often you met, and how you managed that people still had an engagement for a longer period and not only met like 2 times or so, but how do you manage it to make it work, actually, these steering group, and how you made them effective?
Well, I'll take your first question first, which was the power of art. Well, I probably had a very good art history tutor when I was an undergraduate, who happened to be Caroline Tisdall, who worked with Joseph Beuys. And I was introduced as an undergraduate. I went to see him, and I was involved in a lot of what he did. Oh,
you were frozen between. Yeah. Oh, you're frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so in a way, and also I became involved in Beuys's Free International University, and went with him and others to Documenta. I can't remember which one it was now, but where and throughout Documenta we held discussions about all sorts of different topics. And of course, it was Beuys's real belief that art has a role to play in these things. I think that underpinned everything. But also, having studied art history, I remember when we were working with the hospital campaign, thinking, well, you know, in art history, you have history paintings which are there to promote the people who are powerful, and you see those people and you see the landscape that they're in behind them, whatever. This is about, and that had a real role. I thought, well, why can't we just use art, therefore, to promote the things that we think are powerful? So I suppose it was just in a very straightforward way, actually, thinking I've experienced this in art history as a powerful tool. I understand, I didn't think of it like this, but probably I understand from Boyce's teachings that art has a role to play. So I'm just going to go and do it. So I think probably that's where it came from. Your second question was about the steering groups. I think the reason they worked is that they weren't about getting people together for the sake of it. These people came together, you know, in the East London Health Project because their intention was to get information out about the health issues. You know, the fact that we were involved as artists was the thing that helped that happen. So they were there because of their intention. And similarly in the Docklands, you know, it wasn't like an arts organisation just thinking it would be nice to invite local people to join us. This was people who were working very hard for the future of their neighbourhood, and they saw what we did as a tool for communication that was effective. So therefore they wanted to work with us. I felt very privileged that they did. I mean, it was amazing. They were really interesting meetings. We met only initially once a month. After that, it was more spread out and sometime more informal, and we would go and visit, etc., etc. But I think it's because we're not doing it. We're not doing anything for the sake of art. We're doing it. People are all in it for what they want out of it. And I would say that I've learned that in different projects, people can have different things that they want out of it, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the geezers wanted power for their community, and the young engineer was interested in citizen-led innovation, and that, you know, the gallery was interested in their community program, and I was interested in nothing else but making meaning as an artist. It doesn't matter if your aims come together, then you can all take something different away from it. I realise John's been wanting to ask a question. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. There's been a discernible shift in your work. I mean, you touch on this briefly. A discernible shift in your work from 2008 when you begin to work on the water projects. I mean, I see what you're doing is essentially, from that point onwards, bringing some notion of citizen science into play in the area of art and social engagement. So I wanted to know whether you've actually thought theoretically or in any greater depth about this intersection between citizen science and art and social practice since you began that kind of work.
Yes, actually, probably in not that terminology, but yes. I think what I realised was, I mean, when I started the Active Energy project, I started it instinctively, like artists do. I took my toolbox along and did what I do, which is ask people and listen, etc., etc. But I think what I realised I was doing is I realised that I really trusted that knowledge is held at local level, and that it can be, an artist can help to bring that knowledge into the public domain, where it can enter public discourse, and therefore that can help to change things. Because when I look back on it, that was what I was doing before, but I hadn't quite thought of it in that way. But I actually thought of it differently following the Active Energy project. So working with the health workers unions, working with the people in Docklands, that was all about local knowledge that they had specifically, and that the work that I was doing brought that to public attention. So I suppose that's what it is. But yes, I would say, I would put it in that way, yes. Yes,
Okay,
very well spotted.
Thank you.
We have a question from Mark James.
Hello. Great presentation, Loraine. Nice to meet you. We corresponded a while back with regard to Bruce Barber's project. So I thought I'd show this here. The image. I don't know if this is visible.
I can only see literal art and communicative action.
Okay, so there's something about this interface that doesn't. Okay, the book is Littoral Art and Communicative Action, and it discusses Loraine Leeson's work by Bruce Barber. I just thought I'd mention it, especially in this forum, because we're talking about research on socially engaged art, and so Bruce developed his own approach to these issues. And being Canadian, he's not always discussed as much as some other figures. I first learned about your work from this book, which you probably can't see either. Mapping the Futures. Yeah, this is a terrific anthology. And I have to say, seeing some of your early work that I hadn't seen before, because I've never come across a monograph of your work, but I should look into it. The early work is fantastic. It's amazing. And looking at it, I'm thinking, oh, I could do this with digital tools. But I can't imagine how you arrived at those works so successfully at that time with the methods that were available to you. So, I mean, that work is...
You use what you have and you invent the rest.
Sure. And I think like what's amazing is how successful the result was. So, kudos to you on that work. That's fantastic work. And I've always loved that work. And I've followed this shift over the years that, your practices reflects, which is kind of a shift from public art, or the discussion that was, referenced as public art with billboard projects and that sort of thing, towards community art and now social practice, socially engaged art. So it's kind of interesting because we assume that in postmodernism there are no trends, right? That isms are a thing of the past. Yet a lot of practices, nevertheless, follow a kind of like common trajectory, let's say. I'd like to. I have a few questions. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are, or just anecdotes or anything, because I know you've worked with Condé and Beveridge.
Yeah.
And there's some affinity between your work and Condé and Beveridge's work. But I'm wondering too if you've ever met Stephen Willits, and if you've worked with him.
Stephen Willits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I also have a question for you regarding what's been referred to. I mean, this is one of my
question first, or else I'll forget.
Please.
I mean, so Carol Condé and Carl Beveridge, I think we first met them in the 70s and the 80s. Well, it was when we were just before we put up our first photo mural. I remember Carol came over when we were actually putting up the first image, and she wrote something about it in Fuse magazine. And then since then getting to know about their work, which if anyone here doesn't know it, Carol Condé and Carl Beveridge, two amazing Canadian artists who do work with the labour movement. So we had a lot of backwards and forwards with them, and we did a joint exhibition at the end of the beginning of the 90s at the Kingston conference, which was about the Canada Council, 50 years of the Canada Council, I think it was. So they've been a huge, influence, I would say, and support. And I've really enjoyed their work, and I'm in awe of their work and how they've managed it, and the way they've done photo montage without montaging in the early days. We were always amazed by that. They used to create montages by literally doing sets. And then you mentioned Stephen Willits. Stephen Willits and ourselves were working around the same time, and on overlapping issues, but not in the same way, in the sense that we were working very much with the community. I suppose our work was driven by the community, and he was working in relation to communities, but perhaps not quite so driven by it. I mean, we knew each other and we've met, and I met him again a few years ago. So, you know, we were respectful of each other's work, but I think there's sort of practices that came from different places.
Yeah, certainly Stephen Willett's work was kind of more like Hans Hocke's work in some respects in terms of functionalist and systems theory, which would, you know, kind of conflict with the idea of dialogical practice. My question is, and this is, you know, this is not just a small question for me. All of my work is premised on this, and to some extent. And I'm very interested in class politics. And I did a survey of my University Art Association recently in terms of the themes that are discussed at conference. And class is way down. It's practically non-existent. Nobody mentions capitalism, neoliberalism, Marxism. So, you know, you can cite, you cite Brecht, but nobody's thinking like Brecht, you know, to put it that way. And community, community is way up, right? Community is kind of a, you know, passe-partout. So my question to you is, do you have any reflections on sort of a political shift that has been produced to a certain extent by neoliberalization, where the shift is away from discussion of class and trade unionism towards a more kind of NGO type activism, where on the one hand, it's very, it's easier to a certain extent to get grants and to get support for projects with communities. There was a call for an employee at the AGO about 20 years ago. It's a long time now, but it was for an officer who was doing community work, and they wanted that person to have a zillion qualifications. Like, you had to be able to do digital work, you have to have experience working with communities, and then they were going to pay you for part-time work, something like this, on this kind of like ad hoc basis. So you needed all of these qualifications, and it really seemed like very much like a neoliberal nightmare to some extent. So you've navigated these waters very successfully, but I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about, you know, just the shift from your early work to your newer work in terms of this kind of like political sliding into neoliberalization.
Well, certainly there was a big shift at the end of the 80s. And for us, I think in the UK, it was very much the fact that we had that Conservative government for so long, that there was very little activism in the 90s. It was more, there was more sort of identity politics and single issues. And so it was one of the reasons why I wasn't doing work with activists. And it's one of the reasons I did the Volco project, because there was no one to work with who was really, seemed to be really trying to make things happen. And I thought I would work with the next generation to encourage them that they could create a new world. That was what that project was fundamentally. But I think what's happened now is that, yes, the term community is bandied around rather a lot, and I'm guilty of doing that to some extent. I have to say, some of my work with the in the community-led planning group has been very good for me, because they are very critical of the term community and what it means and what community-led means, and so that keeps me on my toes. But I think the trouble is that what we've had in our funding and cultural systems is that we've moved to a very much a top-down way of going about things. When we raise money by putting forward a good idea, well, now everything is controlled from the top. And so when even if you're applying for funding, even if you're going to the Arts Council, which purportedly lets you apply for anything, by the time you've filled out all their forms, you're doing what they want. So they are trying to, you know, with the best will in the world, the Arts Council is trying to impose good practice. But as I say, as I've said several times, if you try and impose good practice, you don't get the other thing they want, which is innovation. You have to support rather than direct. And so much of the funding and control is top down through commissions, through funding, through commissions mainly. Most of the work is commissions that artists get in the community that I've seen, and of course that always has interest. It has vested interests. I mean, is it a developer who's doing the commissioning, or is it? It might be a local authority, but they have their own. They have their own aims. They have their own tick boxes that they want you to fulfill, and so there's a lot of lip service, I think, to the notion of community and to working with people. But I think there's not a lot of work that's really supported that actually really seeks to engage and build the work out of that engagement. And where it is, it's very important. And we need to move, certainly in the UK, we need to move to a better funding system so that we can begin to support rather than direct.
We're almost out of time, or we are like at the end of our time, but we still have 2 hands up by Alexei and Mina. And if you're willing, Loraine, I would suggest that we take these last 2 questions.
Yes,
Alexei, a short question.
Yes. Hello. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. Very nice. Thank you for a very nice and insightful talk. Extremely intelligent and showing all this huge trajectory from 70s to now. And actually, I try to be short as possible because Marco already covered part of my question, because I was also going to ask about this shift, because actually personally I'm living in East London, so I was especially kind of feeling, and I moved from other country to this place 10 years ago, so, and I only can hear about some glorious past, some activism that happened in this area, but now you can see only this sort of, basically council is labor and they still do this gentrification and building these huge ugly buildings everywhere. So definitely very depressing and also knowing about this all past very inspiring kind of activism and art, kind of interjection, etc. So, but my question was exactly like, do you feel that you shift to internet was somehow kind of prompted by this kind of depressing turn into this politics, obviously. But also I wanted to say something about this, you mentioned that how this community, again, it's really inspiring talk, so I took a lot from this talk, especially this sort of pre-internet, pre-computer era, which is just really exciting to have these images and to have your kind of brilliant narration about what happened at this bigger context, Thatcherism and all these shifts. So I mean, just brilliant, and I learned a lot. But I'm thinking that maybe I would be more critical about this university research culture, which is extremely neoliberal now, and what they call knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange or impact is just most obscene words, which just basically destroy any kind of inspiration to do any research, especially after 10 years of Tory government, which somehow triple tuition fees, corporatize universities. So I mean, just a small comment on this end of your talk. So, and so I was thinking about how you can see, I mean, again, I'm not asking you to extend this narrative into the future, but do you see any kind of, even knowing your experience in all this activist and art, do you see any potentials for return of real kind of activism, again, back to public space, not just in internet, which is now definitely also neoliberalized and completely inflated and lost all its utopian aspiration for community building, etc. I mean, it's a too general question, but maybe. And for Mark, actually, picking up for your set about class, it was just recently a huge issue of, you know, this journal Crisis and Critique, and they did a whole issue on class with very interesting contributions by so many. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm sorry, the sound was coming and going, and
My question just yes, if you can, I don't know, it's just a comment, maybe not a question about this, how this Mark already said this, how this university research culture and funding system, which is obviously neoliberal, how they meet with this sort of community art. But my question was, okay, I will jump into a new question. So do you see any kind of potential to return, not exactly to this glorious 70s or 80s, but any kind of spring of hope within this sort of activism and public? For me, it was like last time a moment was Occupy movement, probably like more than 10 years ago.
I mean, absolutely, I do. I think people want to make changes, and I think you use what resources there are. I mean, I'm delighted to be in research culture. I'm not changing what I do through being in research culture. I'm delighted that knowledge exchange is recognised. It's fine. I do it anyway. So I'm not changing what I do. And I think people will, you see it, people will rise up, people will make changes. They'll use what technology they have, they'll use what resources there are, and they'll do it. So I don't have any I don't have any doubts. It's just that it's just when. I don't know.
You cannot be a prophet, so I'm not asking you this.
But I still think you can do things. I still think that you can do, but you have to work round. And I think young people, particularly in a very difficult position, because it's much harder for them to survive, to get on, to just have the basics of life. I think it is a difficult time now, but I don't think that's a reason to be pessimistic for the long term.
Yeah, thank you.
Was it Mina? Was it?
Yes. Hello, Loraine. Thank you so much. Fascinating historical overview of your work. I really like the way Mark also put, which was one of my questions, but I'll leave that, the historical trajectory of concern from very questions of land, very materialist questions, to identity, to planetary imagining, to then the tidal power project, which I think I would another time want to know a bit more about, because particularly you said it involves working class men, and that I thought was fascinating. It seems like it's bringing together a number of different issues. But my question isn't about that. What I want to know is that, so when you're working on London, as in the Docklands, every other project, you have an intimacy with the place, because you know the politics, you know the history, you know various parameters, including why funding has changed, why politics has changed, everything. So you locate your art and you are working with a very intense, very deep knowledge of what's happening. But compare this to the two other projects that you mentioned, the HRC ones, which was Jaipur project on Jal, which is water, and the Kashmir Pulwama project, which had the name Pulwama. So I'm assuming the Pulwama project happened after the attack in February 2019. Have I got that right? It was the soldiers who were killed in a
it's after that. Yes, yeah.
It's part of that, right? And so the children would be children of people who died. So now that's an extremely complex and a very politically wrought project in some ways, about the presence of the army there, why it's there, and why is it. And now the recent, you would probably know this, the recent revelation, accusations made that the right-wing government now made use of that Pulwama disaster to win the election and get back into power in 2019. And accusations are made that that could have been averted, because people in 2019, the local government was demanding that they should give them they needed planes to transfer the soldiers rather than put them in a convoy. And this was the disaster waiting to happen, and they did nothing. So it's come back into play in some ways. So my question is, when with these other projects, other places where you may not have the same level of understanding, the depth of understanding and the politics of it, how confident do you feel in using your art in that way? I mean, are you confident that you're working with the right people? So some of it you have explained as probably also directed by funding things, the HRC project. So you're working with colleagues, and so there are these contingencies which make you take those projects. they're not necessarily directed by your own desire, your own drive, as it does in London, right? Here you're responding to conditions, but you're driven by your politics. So my question is, when you're working with other places, how confident do you feel as an artist in taking on these issues, which the dynamics of which you do not fully grasp because you're not connected to it in the same way? So what kind of dilemma does it pose an artist when they take and do this work, socially engaged practice and work with other places? And so that's my question.
I suppose I have to sort of sidestep it because I'm in a way not taking on the issues. I'm working with the people who are working there and ensuring that the arts come in to help to make a difference. So in Pulwama, there was already a connection made by others with the school and there was already an art therapist who was working with them. So we supported that art therapist and also the puppeteer to work with them. So in a way, I'm not directing that project. I'm just ensuring that the arts are being used, the artists are actually taken on, and that they are doing it. And the same in Rajasthan. It was the artists there who then worked with more local artists. So I'm not trying to direct them. In fact, I'm a co-I on those projects. So I'm not directing the projects, but I'm not trying to direct the issues. I accept, just as I've been working with I suppose, people in the other on health issues or Docklands, I didn't know about those issues. I supported what they wanted to do, but I didn't try and tell them what it was we had to say or how we did it. So I'm sort of bringing the arts to bear on something that other people are doing, who I'm trusting because they're involved and they seem to be trying to do something that seems worthwhile. I agree that I think it's much more difficult on these projects, on these big HRC funded ones, where I mean, I wouldn't dream of going and doing a project somewhere like that. I almost wouldn't dream of going and doing a project anyway. I did one in Pittsburgh, but I did that in a way where I related it to what I was already doing, and I let the older people talk to each other and work out what they wanted to do. So I facilitated it, I suppose. But generally speaking, I'm happy to be, if I'm leading a project, I'm preferring to work in my area where I have an understanding. But I also feel that if there is, if there is a situation where the arts can be seen to work and people don't know how to go about it, I can help, as I did in Rajasthan, bring in some artists from India to actually put them in touch with the environmental scientists so that they could work with them. And I didn't tell them what they should do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is a thing about containment of a problem and a critical understanding and exposing of the problem. You know, you can use art both ways, and that is the issue. I mean, if you're not involved with this, what the problem is, then you might think you're which side of the artist. You know, which artists are you helping? I'm not saying that they aren't the right people that you did help with, but I'm simply saying from one's own position of lack of full grasp of the problem, you could actually be helping the wrong side.
I take your point. I think it is a complex area to negotiate. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Loraine. Thank you all for the discussion. Karen, do you want to?
It was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And I think we are really, really happy to have it
make a point?
recorded.
Can I make a final point? Just very quickly. Okay, I just wanted to make a clarification. Just in some ways, what I said was interpreted as somehow in the past that things were better in the past, or that labor is something associated with men, or unions are associated with men or something. I don't know. I'm just reading between the lines. But in terms of nostalgia, I mean, we may have more nostalgia soon than we realize, because in the US, the Supreme Court passed a law where a company can sue a union if they lose, if somehow they lost money during a strike, which basically makes a strike pointless at this point. They've also, the Senate has passed a statement against socialism, and there's moves by the UK government to make socialism anathema as somehow antisocial in the UK. So we may have more nostalgia.
Vote it up next year then.
Yeah, let's look. We have that to look forward to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also for the discussion and for attending and this really fascinating talk.
Yes, and
thank you.
please also attend the next lecture. It will take place on the July 6th with Julia Krivich from the Sunflower Solidarity Community in Warsaw. And yeah, hope to see you all there again. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.